Live streaming is on.
Yeah, we have done it already.
So,
Yes, done it. The session started now.
so um, uh, Krish, Ashok sir, if you are here, you can probably start the
Sure.
yeah.
So I think, yeah. So I think interesting thing is that when I saw Great Indian Kitchen, I happened to just discover it on one of these streaming platforms, and then I recommended it, to my wife, which is interesting because so I'm Tamil and my wife is Malayali, and yet in this case it was I who recommended it to her. And at the moment she saw it, the first thing she did is she saw it once, then she called her mom, and they watched it together again. And then the both of them called all the female relatives in their extended family, and they said, all of you need to watch this film and make sure your husband is there in the room, when you watch this film. And so I think it clearly, and one thing that I spoke to a lot of my women friends, and all of them said one thing that truly common thing that all of them said is that this film was truly triggering, right, in the sense that it really just it captured something that all of them had experienced either in their lives or seen their mothers and grandmothers experience, their extended family experience it. So in essence, clearly I think this film captured something about the zeitgeist of the Indian kitchen, especially in how it is such a critical, almost like an underpinning of patriarchy, right? Often I think food, and I kind of I talked about it in the Tampopo discussion as well. Food more than anything else um, is so critical to how we define, how we see ourselves, how we identify ourselves. And in fact, you would not actually have religions and caste and many of these other things if not for the fact that they also come with these food related rules. There is no very few religions on the planet have like, oh, you go ahead and eat anything you want, right? And it is almost always there is some rule or the other, right? Either some restrictions at some point of time, oh, you will eat this, you will not eat this, or during this time I will eat this versus I will not eat it, and so on. And it is therefore not surprising that, yeah, at least in the Indian subcontinent, the food has remained a central, and in fact you can extend it to beyond many Asian cultures, African cultures, everywhere as well, right? That food, the culture of home cooking essentially sustains patriarchy because it's a form of labor that largely over history that only women have performed. And obviously, when it comes to professional kitchens, of course, you'll find male chefs and so on because there's money to be made. But the moment it's free, unpaid labor, it's almost always going to be a woman. And this is particularly sort of highlighted beautifully in the movie, uh, uh, in that the Indian obsession with uh, everything being made fresh, right? No use of fridge, no use of any appliances that can make your life quicker, faster. No, none of that is allowed, right? Everything has to be somehow made fresh. And it's interesting, and it's essentially men having these opinions despite knowing nothing about food or nutrition or cooking. They still have these rules about, oh, no, fresh food is good. There is absolutely no evidence that it is, and so on. But it's still, and I think the way the film, my favorite part of the movie are actually the scenes where absolutely nothing is happening and it's just drudgery in the kitchen. And you're like, okay, why am I watching somebody wash these dishes for a couple of minutes when maybe that scenes could have been dispensed with? Absolutely not, because I think it really just highlighted what this drudgery is really like in the average Indian kitchen. And I think in that sense, it was an absolute work of genius, as far as I was concerned. And there's an interesting sort of, I have a couple of other broader comments about the distinctions between different parts of India. Whether will this movie have been different if it was set in, say, Punjab, or Bengal or elsewhere. But I think we'll probably keep that for a subsequent conversation as well. So those are just my opening thoughts about how absolutely brilliant this movie was in really capturing this particular essence of patriarchy being sustained by something that we all do 2 or 3 times a day, which is cook and eat food.
Interestingly, our book is also something deals with the aspect of freshness and the tradition of Indian cooking. And I've also come to notice that the Great Indian Kitchen was, in some sense, an inspiration to some aspect of the book.
Well, actually, so finally, my book came before Great Indian Kitchen. So, so the interesting thing is that for me, I think the idea of using science or engineering in the context of the kitchen was not just sort of exercise in sort of geekery, but really an attempt to say that look, we should be spending less time, right? And many of the things that essentially make kitchen work laborious do not have to be that way. Because we're not living in the 18th century. We have fridges, and it might come as a surprise to you, but actually, frozen food in most situations is fresher than fresh food. Frozen vegetables are fresher than fresh vegetables. Okay, because fresh vegetables are actually harvested unripe, and they spend a lot of time in transportation and in stores before it actually gets to you. Frozen vegetables are frozen few hours after they are harvested. And once anything is at a temperature of below -15, it's actually frozen in time, right? So literally a frozen carrot is fresher and more nutritious than a fresh carrot, with the exception of a carrot that you actually harvest yourself from the ground. Any carrot you buy from the store is less fresh than a frozen carrot. And so it's just that this and the use of appliances and the use of things like instant pots and pressure cookers and cutting devices, and more importantly, the ability to cook parts of your food and freeze them or put them in the refrigerator, extend their shelf life, and literally only spend 5 minutes cooking. There's a difference between why, like for example, women have a slightly better time in Southeast Asia than in India. It's because if you look at Thai cooking, a whole bunch of it is basically goes into making the paste, right? And the paste can be made ahead of time: red curry, green curry, yellow curry, masaman curry, it doesn't matter, right? So there's multiple variations, different spices, different ingredients. You make the paste and they freeze it, right? In some cases they don't freeze it, they just put it in the regular refrigerator. Point is that you can make a Thai dish by taking that paste, cooking it down in oil, adding your ingredients, adding coconut milk, and you're done with that gravy, right? So why would we not do this sort of modular redesign of Indian cooking itself? Is, again, it's simply down to the fact that people have this ridiculous notions that somehow everything has to be made fresh and ground up, and there's absolutely no evidence that somehow it is better, and so on. Most men would not be able to tell in a blind taste test which dish was made with frozen ingredients and which was made with fresh ingredients.
Whilst you spoke about the difference between refrigerated and fresh food, the images from the film kept flickering in our eyes. I mean, in our brain. So I think we can probably.
Yes. So the amazing thing is that I had a friend who showed this film to her Punjabi grandmother, right? And she actually had a rather fascinating reaction, very offbeat reaction to the film. And she said, "Oh, this woman has it easy. Why is she complaining?" Right? And it's actually quite interesting. The reason being that within India itself, there are differences between. So, for example, rice-centric cultures like South India and Bengal and so on, versus wheat-centric cultures, chapati, paratha, centric cultures like North India and so on. So if you look at overall sort of social indices, right, what you will find is that rice-centric cultures tend to be better for women than wheat-centric cultures, and for no reason other than the fact that you can cook a ton of rice in one shot. For the family, but you have to make a chapati after chapati linearly, and it's a very backbreaking effort to cook 40 chapatis for a large family and so on, right? And so almost what happens is that what you find is that in India there is like a strange correlation between rice centric cultures and women getting educated and women literacy and wheat centric cultures. And so in a sense, what this lady was basically saying is that, boss, her life is easy because she only has to cook rice. That was her point. Okay. That if it was wheat, it's even much harder. You have to sit and literally make chapatis like all day. The amount of hours you need to spend in the kitchen, if you are a wheat centric culture, is like 2 to 3 times more. And so it's quite interesting how even within this society, right, and that there are all these so many differences and nuances as well, and sort of intersectionalities. Yeah.
True. True, absolutely true. So I think we can probably go around with the others, and probably they can share their initial reaction, which regarding film, and we can dive into the film much deeper as we move forward. So, Ayu, would you like to go ahead and um, talk about the film? Share your initial thoughts. We're not getting audio from your end, Ayu. Whilst Ayu fixes her audio, I think we can probably go forward. And Dakshani, would you like to share your thought on the film? Mm, okay. So, Vivek, would you like to take your turn? Mm, okay. So, Jeffrey, would you want to go ahead?
Yeah, hi. So where do I start? This film is like what, less than a year old, and it's already got a lot of us talking. That itself should speak to the amount of how provocative or how just how huge the impact was that this film led us on. Also, like oddly enough, I heard about this movie from my mother, who wanted to watch it sometime shortly after it came out on Stream, before it came out on Prime Video. So it was already making the news on Malayalam media, and it was leading to a lot of discussions, a lot of these news panel debates on how accurate or how biased it was or not, and it was quite a revolting piece of work, right? Art, in that sense, like it kind of got us all to question just how much just recheck our privileges, like as men or as uh, yes, like having look also with the pandemic, it's even like I think you could even say that the effect has doubled, right? The strain on. I think there have been a lot of studies over the last year that have documented how much of the women's workforce had to give away their jobs just so they could keep up with the tasks at home, household tasks and whatnot. So this coming out just in the wake of that, this film coming out just in the wake of that was quite a like it was quite a it did leave quite a effect on the audience. And even despite all that, I think even with respect to the filmmaking aspects, it's quite a like it's a quite an unusual Malayalam film. Malayalam films typically tend to rely more on scripting and dialogue. I think it's only in recent years where we have really made use of the visual aspects of film uh, to make a point or to creatively, like we've used cinematography and sound in larger effect to drive home the point. So and like I don't need to. I'll obsess over all the overhead shots and the sound effects used and all later in the discussion. But I think I'll keep it at this. It's quite a uh, it's qu- it's quite a film. It's quite something to watch.
True. And I think it's actually interesting how it's the kitchen that the filmmaker thought was appropriate to highlight patriarchy, despite it having its arms reached out to a lot of other sectors of women's lives. So, Ashok sir, would you like to comment on why you think a kitchen would be the most appropriate to describe the influence of patriarchy on women?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's not just the kitchen. I think probably, although it just happens in the context of a particular scene, I think the bedroom is as much an important element of that. I think there is that one scene. I think pretty sort of very powerful scene about foreplay and so on, which I think is also quite brilliantly done, in my opinion. So I think if you look at it historically, the kitchen and the bedroom are essentially the places where of historical sort of men's control over women's bodies as well as their labor, right? And again, in if you think about food, right? If you look at hunter-gatherer societies, they actually tend to be more egalitarian. And the problem is that often that since there are very few hunter-gatherer societies left, barring the ones perhaps sort of the jungles of New Guinea and the Amazonian forests, where there are still sort of tribes that have not been exposed to modernity and so on. It's very hard, but I think there is now increasing evidence that hunter-gatherer societies were a lot more egalitarian, because I think while there was a clear distinction in terms of labor, in terms of who is perhaps going out and hunting versus who is perhaps gathering fruits and berries and sort of but also cooking. I mean, but I think the men also, since they did the hunting, they also had to do a lot of the things like the skinning, if you will, and some of the more physically strenuous stuff like actually climbing up trees and picking up stuff, etc. So in that sense, as long as there was sort of like a labor distinction about who did what, etc., right? And I think you almost had some they were problematic societies in many other ways, but at least they were relatively more egalitarian. The rise of what we today see as the patriarchal sort of culture is rooted in post-agricultural societies. The moment you had agricultural societies, I think what ended up happening is that you essentially now needed someone to sit at home and just do this and nothing else. And I think if you could perhaps control that labor, and then therefore control many other aspects of things, obviously reproductive rights, and many other aspects of this, when people get married, and you look at cultures where, you can actually look at cultures where dowry is either where the woman pays the man's side the dowry versus where the man side has to pay women a dowry. In fact, within India itself, Dalit communities are far more likely to be situations where the man has to pay the dowry, because in some of those societies, women are seen as being more productive in every sense of the word, not just from a reproductive standpoint, but also from a actual labor standpoint of actually working in the fields. In fact, rice cultivation, generally many rice growing cultures, the rice plant is planted by the woman, and a lot of these things have been sort of institutionalized into tradition and so on. So obviously I think the kitchen is has been a place where I think for most of history, I think it's essentially the place where women's hopes and dreams have largely died, if you will, right? Because at the end of the day, you have to feed the family, and most people cannot afford to keep like a cook and so on. And it's almost always, so it's logical. And in India particularly, that you combine that with the additional ideas of food has to be fresh, everything has to be cooked, this thing, and everything has to be made fresh, and you will not use modern appliances because they apparently spoil taste and so on, and all of these kinds of ideas, they all kind of combine into really just sort of turning it into literally a prison, if you will, in a way. And the interesting thing is that this happens in a spectrum, right? And in a film, you could you could obviously show a slightly extreme view of a character who says, no, I will not let you use a pressure cooker, right? But the problem is that there will be men who will say, I'm okay with a pressure cooker, and see themselves as being very women friendly, but then also exhibit behaviors where they quietly assume that they will that this person will do all the cooking, right? There are people in my family, men who say that I personally like the taste of chutney that's been ground in a mortar and pestle, but I'm okay with chutney made in a mixie, or for that matter, even male children coming back from school, then essentially saying that. Oh no, cabbage again today. I've done that as a child. I've done that, right? And with no realization. If this was the West, those parents would have told me to say that if you say something like that, you don't get food. You go to your room. That's it. You go hungry. Because that kind of behavior is not tolerated. But no, I mean, no Indian parent will scold a child for exhibiting essentially traces of patriarchal behavior that then ultimately sort of as they grow older, it just becomes normal. It's completely okay to perhaps comment negatively about food when you have absolutely no role in its making, or not offer to wash dishes, and many of these kinds of things, I guess. So absolutely, the kitchen is very central to the entire enterprise.
True. That's a very elaborate and detailed take on it. And we see a lot of uh, over the head shots on the cooking. How authentic do you think the shots were?
As since my wife is Malayali, and I have spent a lot of time in her ancestral home and the homes of her relatives in Trivandrum. Yeah, I mean, it literally could have been any one of those houses. So obviously, it's incredibly accurate in terms of also the choice of dishes, and the kinds of expectations that men will often have in terms of what they want to eat and when they want to eat and how they will eat, and the fact that they will be served first and the women will eat later. And even other, actually, if you other small little things, I don't think these were covered in the film, but like for example, the women often will eat the head of the fish. The men will not eat the head of the fish, and over time, it's sort of become a thing where women consider the fish head and the eyes particularly a delicacy, where men will not eat that part of the fish, and so on. So there are many layers to this, but I think overarching, I think and in general, the fact that in many of these homes. And this is sort of something strange I find about Kerala, that sometimes as with wealth, there is sometimes a regression to saying that no, I will not use a wet grinder, I will not use a mixie, I will actually end up, I have a big house, but I'll end up building like a stove that sort of is powered by firewood and so on. Whereas what you often find in more poorer communities is that the moment they have some amount of wealth, the very first thing they do is invest in appliances. They save time, and allow them to do other things other than simply sit and cook. And so it's something interesting as well. Yes, absolutely. So it's very accurate in my opinion.
Is there a particular reason for them to uh, consider fish heads a delicacy? Or is there a particular reason men did not really eat them?
So this is across the world. You will often find that disadvantaged groups, particularly at various levels, right? So one is that sort of you can look at say the nobility and the serfs and peasants, for example, or you could have a sort of a master and a slave sort of a setup, as well as in this case sort of men and sort of women who are seen as being secondary and so on. Around the world, you will often find that the lesser, shall we say, less desirable parts of the food, right? Particularly meat. So, for example, organs, intestines, and other awful parts of the meat, etc., would not be eaten by the richer people, right? So they would end up being, and so, for example, black people have evolved cuisines that use all of these really bad cuts of meat and turn them into delicious food through, say, more longer, cooking and smoking and barbecuing and other techniques, for example, in the context of the US and so on. And likewise in India, what we often find is that whenever there's and since India's gone through famines and food shortages so regularly in the last 200 years, thanks to some poor colonialist decisions and so on, you will find that women end up eating the worser bits, and they're far more likely to be, undernourished and so on. So fish heads is one of those things. So men will not eat fish heads. It's seen as being disgusting, right? So in a way, it reminds you of the fact that this was once a living thing. And so no, people have sort of a visceral reaction to eating anything that reminds them of the fact that this was at one point of time a living, breathing, moving thing. And heads essentially and eyes and things like that are often, in that category.
It's interesting. Vivek, do you want to go ahead?
I think Jeffrey or someone said he had wanted to say something as well. Yeah.
Yeah, Vivek
Vivek,
raised his
sure,
hand to
sure.
speak, and
Sure.
Jeffrey can go right now.
Yeah. All right.
Jeff, you can go first. I'll go after you.
Nothing else. I just wanted to add to the fish head discussion because it's something that, I mean, it's something that I've noticed through my life. So again, like I think Krish already did explain all that later on. So I don't have much to add apart from just to add to Krish's points about it. Yeah. Vivek, you can go on.
Yeah, so I got a message from one. I heard I was called out. So I was on another call. Sorry about that. So I have a question for Mr. Ashok, and this may be less related to food and more anthropological in a way. That you mentioned that our civilizations in general were hunter-gatherer societies at one point, and they used to be more egalitarian. So wanted to ask, how did this evolution come to where it is today?
I think it's a complicated question, and it's not that straightforward. I think Yuval Noah Harari in *Sapiens* sort of has one point of view, and obviously other academics kind of say that it wasn't quite that straightforward either. And there are more nuances, and there may have been variations around the world. But the rough story essentially is that is about saying that in general, small population, small groups of people, very mobile, constantly moving, are likely to be more egalitarian. In a sense, for many reasons. So, for example, hunter-gatherer societies, women will not have more than one child. And if they do have multiple children, they will often space it out because the last thing you want to do is to be able to, you can't carry two children and then be on the move as well, right? And so so they will often, therefore they're far more likely to have agency in planning when they want to have a child, right? As opposed to sedentary people where basically women ended up getting turned into basically baby production machines and so on, right? So the second thing is that but hunter-gatherer societies obviously lack scale, meaning that you can't have like a billion population of just hunter-gatherer values because you do need to organize labor in a way that you can exploit it at some level so that you can sustain society, right? So you can't have agriculture without having labor, okay, without having people who are willing to till the land, and that's nasty work. And so obviously no one wants to do that, right? And so therefore you over time it's natural that societies will end up creating an underclass that has no choice but to do it. And in some sense, this is sort of like the root of general hierarchies in human society, is that the moment you want to have a large, complicated civilization where you have where you should be able to produce a food surplus, and you don't need everyone producing food, because then you need to have people who are soldiers, you need to have people who are producing things, etc., etc. But then you need someone to make your food, and that's the nastiest, hardest job to do. And so you need an underclass that does that, right? And so that's the sort of like the origin of hierarchies, and therefore the ability for you to coordinate larger civilizations. And essentially, one key thing you need to do is to control women's reproduction, so that you have a supply of human beings that can sustain your population and give you an advantage, if you will, right? So it's quite logical that you're going to naturally kind of do that, and it happened in varying different societies in different means and forms. And you can look at holy books everywhere. Even the ones that are relatively considered more egalitarian, like Buddhism, are pretty misogynistic in how they look at women and so on. And it's every religion, right? Ultimately, the biblical be fruitful and multiply versus what you see in the Manusmriti versus what you see in Judaism, what you see in Islam. They're all at some level all sort of originated at that sort of inflection point between purely hunter-gatherer societies to more settled, large agricultural sort of civilizations. So that's essentially how we came to where we are, and we're sort of still living in that space, except that in the 20th and 21st century, we sort of made this point where you reached a point where you don't necessarily need to kind of permanently oppress an underclass, and that's why you started having these movements. You had the communist movement to say in the 20th century to sort of basically be about workers' rights and so on, right? People think communism and immediately think, oh, Russia, Stalin, Mao, and so on. But the bulk of the output of the communist movement was essentially in the West, where things like workers' rights, things like the 40-hour work week, and the fact that you won't work 16 hours a day, and the fact that children will not work, and the fact that at some level, at least women and men will get paid roughly the same thing, and so on. All of these were results of the sort of like the workers' rights and communist movements in the early part of the 20th century, and so on. Then you had the women's rights movements in the 1920s and so on. So that's essentially, we kind of got to where we are. We're still on that journey, but essentially the switch from hunter-gatherer societies to large, sophisticated agricultural societies naturally necessitated, if you will, patriarchy, necessitated many of these things. Yeah, that's essentially how all of this came to be.
So with usually civilizations that in some sense live on the coastal areas, we see the groups which are considered mostly vegetarian also turn pescatarian. I think West Bengal is a really good example for that. Is there a particular reason they move away from the non-vegetarian food to vegetarian food? Since in our earlier discussion, you had mentioned how the elite, the Brahminical elite, were also non-vegetarians at some point of time.
Yes. So India is quite an interesting case in the sense that the elevation of vegetarianism as a marker for eliteness in society it was a function of Buddhism and Jainism, and not really Hinduism per se. In a sense that the whole ideas of ahimsa, the ideas of the way the Jains think about food and so on, was in a sense came as a backlash to what was seen as overarching corruption in the priestly class. And if you've read the Vedas, there's just a lot of animal sacrifices. Almost all havans and so on essentially involved animal sacrifices. And I'll say this too, and it involves cattle as well, right? A lot of cattle sacrifices as well. And so interesting. So by around the Adi Shankara's time is when
there is some echo from your end.
No, not from my end, because I'm wearing I think it is. I'm just seeing. Are you still hearing the echo? No, not now. Yeah. So I think it's your end. Yes. Yeah. So essentially, what ended up happening is, but around the 8th or 9th century, around Adi Shankara's time, is when, in a sense, I think that was when the Shaivite cult of Hinduism sort of got integrated, or what were ultimately multiple different faiths, etc., were sort of integrated into a single sort of pan-India consciousness of what might be a single religion. In that sense, there was still sort of debates with Vaishnavites going till the 12th and 13th century, right, and so on. And then I think the invasions from the northwest, if you will, kind of helped combine Shaivism and Vaishnavism again to create sort of one consciousness of what a religion might be, and so on. And then we had the freedom movement and all the rest of that, right? So in that sense, vegetarianism became a signifier around the 8th or 9th century AD, when it is estimated that basically the Brahmins became vegetarian, right? It was seen as being a virtue worth having, right? Prior to that, only Buddhist monks were vegetarian. The Hindu elite were absolutely not. They were, in fact, some of the biggest meat eaters, if you go by what the Vedas talk about, right? If you go by what the even the Mahabharata or the Ramayana and so on, there is just so many references to eating meat, right? And people sometimes forget that Sita didn't ask Rama to go hunt for a deer for her to have as a pet, right? It was because venison was her favorite meat, and anyone who's read the Valmiki Ramayana will kind of know that, and so on. So that's why, in particularly the subcontinent, just like how bland food became a signifier of elitism around the 15th and 16th century in Europe, because by then, thanks to colonialism, spices were so cheap that the poor started, eating spices. So then the rich said, no, now we'll stop eating spices, and they evolved kind of, in at least in France, they evolved a cuisine that is like ultra minimalist, and we will focus on the pure quality of the ingredients and the quality of the wine and the quality of the sauce and those kinds of things, and not really rely on adding spices, which they saw as an easy way out. And so therefore hot cuisine was seen as something that, as a signifier there. And likewise in India, I think not eating meat was seen as a marker of elitism for almost the last 1200 years or so, right? The exceptions obviously are that if you live in a mountainous place like Kashmir, right, or you live in a seaside place like Bengal, and so on, you are essentially going to not have access to easy protein all through the year, because you can't like grow dal all the time. Okay, and again in slightly more sandy coastal places, again, you can't grow legumes all through the year and so on. So naturally, either you're under-nourished and die, so you are going to eat fish. So you look at the Mangalore, Maharashtrian coast, the Karnataka coast, as well as Kerala, as well as Bengal and Orissa and so on. You will find that coastal communities almost always, even the elites, will eat seafood. And in mountains where essentially you can't get food during winter, you are absolutely going to eat mutton and so on. So Kashmiri pundits and so on will absolutely eat mutton. Yeah. So
It's interesting. From a cinematic point of view, I think it's actually interesting to notice how there is absolutely little to no use. I mean, there are probably a few shots scattered here and there. We don't really see a lot of close-ups in a film that practically emphasizes on the audience empathy and a sense of regret on the characters. So it's mostly medium shots and medium shots with a high angle, or medium shots with a lower angle. So I think that was, like Jeffrey mentioned, a very interesting approach and a very fresh look at Malayalam cinema, since much of the films mostly focused on the story and not on the technical aspects of filmmaking.
And also dialogues, actually. They actually, there's generally Malayalam films tend to have like almost 2 times more pages of dialogues than most other films.
Yeah.
Like people are constantly talking. Talking never stops. If you look at older Malayalam films, there is literally no break. People are talking from start to finish.
Okay, I think you and Jeffrey can speak for the authenticity of the dialogues and how close to the current generation it is.
Yeah, no. So the interesting thing, I mean, obviously, it would have been lovely to ask the director about it, but I think my personal theory on the use of the lack of close-ups, if you will, right, and I kind of pointed out the camera stays on some of the most mundane chores, right, for an inordinately long time, and I believe that's a deliberate stylistic choice to truly drive the point home of how painful running a kitchen actually is, especially when you have no help, when you have to do all of it yourself. And again, it's not the cooking that's the hard part. It's all of the prep and the cleaning that's just so painful. And in a sense, I think it's almost as if the director wanted the viewers to say, just look at the whole thing and look at how painful this is. Look at how large the kitchen is. Look at how dirty it is, and look at how hard it is to manage and maintain. Don't get distracted by the emotions or the person's face and so on. I want you to keep looking at this space, because this space is literally a prison, and you need to keep looking at it. And it's almost that's what it felt like to me. Of course, it could be wrong, but at least that's how it felt to me.
Yeah, and also to add the lack of music in any of those scenes, like the context could be changed so easily. But if you just place a song, or a lot of these old Malayalam films used to have like songs of how a woman is supposed to behave, and
Yes.
the ideal devout woman.
Exactly.
A lot of them used to, like, I think a lot of the older ones had a trope of the the devout,
the dutiful wife,
the dutiful mother, the caring mother, the dutiful wife, the humble sister. So it all adds to all of this. I mean, the way it's shown in this film, it all is like a critical take on those tropes. Like, right, be it even the mother in this movie, right? The mother-in-law in this movie, how she treats her versus how she treats her own daughter. Uh, and and even with the maid, I think the maid itself, the worker who comes to the house, uh, I think that itself could warrant a whole discussion on its own. The scenes with her scenes and the way how she how free she's shown to be compared to Nimisha's character. uh, and yeah, Krish mentioned, even with the dialogues, I believe it was mostly improvised, all the dialogues. uh, and Yeah, like it was pretty fresh. And what I also liked was that the men weren't, caricaturally evil, or they weren't made to, like, in any other film, the quote unquote antagonists would be like written or performed to be a lot more, uh, uh, I mean, it would be a slightly more exaggerated. Here, it was just done just so much that you could see where, you could immediately pick up on it, and it wasn't, and that's what makes it even more hard hitting, right? Be it even
Exactly.
when. Even when the father-in-law suggests her to not take up the job, saying that the വീട്ടിലൊരു പെണ്ണുള്ളത് ഒരു ഐശ്വര്യമാണ്. That is, having a woman in the house is like a sign of, it's a
Yeah.
blessing all on its own. Like, you hear those, like, you don't know, those dialogues, like things like that are so common. You hear like that, it just hits you when you see it in this context. Just how entrenched the patriarchy is in our lives.
Yeah, I think it's a brilliant point. Actually, if Suraj had been a comically evil character, then it would have been easy for most men watching this film to say, "I'm better than this guy." Okay, I think it is the fact that people who saw that film, they saw that they're probably like this guy. Okay, and I think that's what made the film so hard hitting. And I think that's the thing. So he could be a nice guy, and all of these things, as you rightly said, is like a spectrum, right? I mean, the problem is that each person is probably trying to find someone who's worse off than him, to therefore feel good about themselves and say, no, I'm not like that, right? People will say things like, without any sense of irony, that I allow my wife to keep her job after marriage, as if that's some sort of like a great achievement, right? Because what that person is mentally doing is comparing themselves against either a previous generation or someone else they know who's worse off, right? And I think it's brilliant how I think this film really breaks some of those tropes and says that, look, you could be a perfectly reasonable nice guy, like zero things like, say, no domestic violence of any kind, and he's really nice like 99% of the time, and he's like, he feels as if he's actually genuinely nice to her and all of that. And that's the thing, and it is basically when you see the patriarchy being represented by this character as the antagonist, and it really just drives the point home, that, oh man, I mean, at least for guys watching this, if they any little bit of self-awareness, they should realize that, oh man, I might consider myself the most woman friendly guy. I've probably been a douchebag to my mother or my grandmother or my wife at some point of time. So I think that's I think the brilliant part of the film.
True, and it also sort of emphasizes on the active and passive roles men take in somehow sustaining the systemic aspect of patriarchy, because you don't really have them actively, pushing women to stay at home, but you Suraj does. I mean, quite like Suraj's role in the entire conversation there. He won't really say no, but at the same time,
Exactly.
when it's his time to support, he don't. I mean, he won't take a stance. The aspect of being, the equivalent of being apolitical in some sense.
Yeah, exactly. Centrist sort of, yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
So that was actually quite interesting.
Yeah.
Do you guys think that there could have been what the movie would have been like hypothetically if it had a negative ending, meaning that it ends as a tragedy, meaning that she's just stuck and she just gives up and essentially lives her life like her mother-in-law, right? Do you think it would have been a better or worse movie?
I would have personally felt a negative ending would have somehow stuck to the tone of the film throughout the film. I mean, through the entire length of the film. But I do understand where he's coming from. This is, in some sense, a film that was made as a protest
Right.
to the structure. So it's understandable that he would do that, but in a natural length of progression, I would ideally see the movie having a negative ending.
I also think that a negative, a positive ending essentially made the movie more accessible to people who may not be like cinephiles, if you will, right?
True.
Somebody who kind of understand the language of cinema and storytelling at a level of depth, and therefore would have found that ending to be slightly jarring with the tone and all of that. The average person watching a movie wants a happy ending at the end of the day, and I think in that sense it sort of delivers that.
Yeah, actually, I can sort of give you an answer from what I've heard from Geo's interviews. Like, apparently, from the director's interviews, apparently it was a heated discussion during the production of the film, and there were I think it was mostly among him, his cinematographer, and the editor who were involved in who were the common pillars in crafting the story, putting the story together, and it did get some criticism from Malayalam media when it had come out, why the ending was tonally different from the rest of the film. And even as a viewer also, I felt that, I mean, this film, it would have been very different if they even had if they had added kids into the mix, right? Or if they added a little, I don't think this ending would have happened in most realistically speaking. But in a way, it's also a release. I think it serves the purpose of a release. It serves the purpose of a conclusion, if anything.
Yeah, true. And also, I think if you, I it's sort of like the season, the fourth season ending of The Handmaid's Tale, right? It's like really 45 episodes of some of the most painfully hard to watch television you can imagine. And so it is just like so the ending of that season, that release, it's almost as if, oh boy, I think the audience truly deserves it, if you will, right? So it's, I think, although in this case it's a short 2-hour film, but yeah, so you're right.
Yeah. But yeah, I would like to hear from the other participants on the end, on what they felt about the ending also, because it would be a quite an interesting debate. Because I've had I remember it being a very heated, I mean, very polarizing thing during the initial discourse of the film.
I think the choice of not having a kid in the I think the choice of not having a kid in the mix, in a way, I think makes that sort of positive ending a lot more justifiable, right? I mean, I think if there was a kid in the mix, then then it would have been a harder thing to pull off.
Yeah.
True.
And it's not a bad ending either. I mean, it's not a it's not a that it's not that removed from reality or anything like that. I don't think it was. It was more like a within the story it does work. It's just that it's what do you call it? It's just slightly more. It's more cinematic, if anything, right? Compared to the rest of the film.
Absolutely. I mean, in the sense that people often don't just leave after putting out sort of one giant display of I hate you. I mean, but obviously it happens as a slow burn in real life more often than not. But I guess obviously you can't depict that in a film, so you'll need that sort of one moment of that whole throwing that wastewater in their face and so on.
Yeah.
True. And interestingly, the whole cinematic timeline was based or set up during the Sabrimala conflict after the Supreme Court judgment. So that added a lot of flair to the uh, you know final rage that goes out from the female
Interesting.
protagonist.
I see. Interesting. Okay.
Was this movie released around that time as well? Like,
No, it's a 2021 film. 2021 or 2024?
21, 21.
21, yeah.
yeah. I think in a way that ending where the if it had gone the other way where she would have succumbed to her situation, I think they in a way they did show that, because throughout the story she keeps running into these other women where the burden of her workload is just transferred to another woman. I think the movie really emphasizes on that, and it culminates in that scene where her brother walks in and he asks for water, and the mom just tells the maid to just get him, and she freaks out. So I think in a way they did show that that could have been possible, where she could have just succumbed and become another person. And well, Suraj goes on to marry another woman who's very happy to just do those things. So yeah, and in a way I guess the ending was pretty cinematic in that way. She's free, and the dance also I felt like was an expression of that freedom. So yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
It just so happens with a couple of directors, who take up a particular subject, a particular issue. Uh, you begin to see a sense of rage coming out, at least from the characters, uh, or from the music in some direction. So it was actually quite interesting that you didn't really see any of these, uh, cinematic elements sprinkled around, and it was only the climax that, in some sense, gave us the idea that this film is a resistance to the systemic structure of patriarchy.
Yeah, I especially liked how it was like the movie did not fall prey. Like it could have easily been extremely dramatic, as I think someone, Krish also said here, which wouldn't have sold the point as well. They tried to make it as sober and as normal looking, like it could be any household. This setting, the director made it look as much similar to that as possible. So yeah, even the end, yeah, except for that throwing the dirty water, yeah, that was the most dramatic moment in the entire movie. Other than that, it was pretty simple, but still quite endearing. Like I did not get bored throughout the movie, even though
Yeah.
it was devoid of this over dramatic elements.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there is also a sense of that cultural accuracy that, in my experience, that what I've seen, for instance, between Tamil culture and the culture of Kerala, is that if you sort of one common thing, if you go to a poor neighborhood in Tamil Nadu, right, every other day, uh, you're gonna hear some woman just screaming her heart out and just kicking her husband out for either coming home drunk or something like that. And so there is that instant, the need to just get into that rage, and so you'll often find Tamil films often kind of capture that a lot more. So people, it's almost as if people are more cinematic in real life, in Tamil Nadu than they are in Kerala, where it's a little bit more simmer, slow boil. People are less prone to this sort of immediate displays, generally lower volume in general. And I think it'll be interesting to see, there are some obviously social and cultural reasons for that, but obviously, that's a separate topic altogether.
True. Vivek, do you want to share your thoughts on your idea of an alternative ending?
Oh, regarding the ending,
Yeah.
I didn't really think of anything. So if you give me a minute, I can come back with something.
Sure. So, Ashok sir, you also spoke about the music the BGM that was used in Tampopo. Do you have any comments on the BGM that was used very minimally in this film?
Yeah, actually, as I think it was Jeff that pointed out,
Mhm.
the lack of music was what was interesting to me rather than the music itself. So normally, what will happen is that women in kitchen, domestic scenes, etc. There's a certain cliche, and you see this not just in Malayalam films, in many other films. There's usually some sort of happy feeling sort of music that evokes that rustic, bucolic, domestic goddess sense of how life is supposed to be, the caring mother, the caring wife, kind of thing. And the fact that the direct very deliberately chose to really say that no, there is nothing remotely positive about this is a prison scene, right? And there will be no uplifting music to help you ignore the fact that this is essentially a prison. And I think that I think was quite an interesting choice. And so I think I appreciated the fact that they used a lot less music in this film than more, actually.
Yeah, and I would like to add on the color palette too of the film. Like with respect to the cinematography, I think it gets like it starts off very bright with very bright colors. Even with the food, it's food legitimately looks delicious or almost like an ad shoot uh, level. Colors on colors initially, and then as it goes on, as we see it over and over again, the lights slowly dim. You see more muted colors come into the kitchen. I think the sunlight seeps in almost like a jail, right? The kitchen itself looks like
A
like
jail,
a
yes.
jailhouse. So
Right. And very unflattering views of the food itself. The vessels all look kind of
yeah,
dirty, kind of chipped and broken.
yeah,
And the way the food is served on the plate itself starts to kind of get not doesn't look like an ad shoot. Like the
yeah.
opening, the film, everything is actually set in far more brighter light, and then by the end, it's like just it's just sort of, yeah.
It's almost like the layers get peeled off, right? The facade gets peeled off as we move from the living
Exactly.
room to the from the dining table to the kitchen
Yeah, yeah.
over time.
So I have another question for Mr. Ashok. You talked about how in India we hesitate to adapt to new technology simply because there is a prevalent notion that all things traditional must be better. So I wanted to ask you that in the last 20-30 years, whatever the new technologies which have come up, whether it's rice cookers in the east or sous vide and instant pot in the west, are there technologies like this which could be easily adapted to Indian cuisine, but they just haven't been able to penetrate the market yet?
No, I think, see, if you, because Indian society is just so layered and complex, it's hard to sort of look at it as a monolith. You will find, upper, middle class kitchens, and especially around the segment of urban upper middle class where both husband and wife are working and they have kids, and but not rich enough to have like servants, like cooks, and so on. Um, they're probably the ones who are adopting larger fridges, buying fridges with freezers so they can store more food. And so in that sense, that sort of westernized culture, because the fact that they're far more likely to be exposed to these things from the internet and perhaps having traveled abroad and so on. But the vast majority of the bulk of India, including the ultra uber rich who are notorious for essentially going back to saying that no, now that I can afford to pay a cook, I can afford to make them do extra labor to make everything, a mortar and pestle and hand ground and so on. But so what you'll often find is that so there's like varying degrees of adoption. It's not like there is no adoption, but there's like varying degrees of adoption. So I think the couple of things like generally that are very poorly adopted. Pressure cooker outside of South India is in general poorly adopted. And what you'll often find that if you go to a small town or a village, they will cook the dal on a regular vessel. I mean, boss, that takes 40-45 minutes, especially if you are cooking something like chana or urad dal and all of that. It's like a notoriously inefficient way to cook dal. Fridges themselves, right? The use of freezers practically non-existent. right? Because freezers allow you to store food that won't go bad for months on end if it's stored properly and you don't have power cuts, and so on, right? And pressure cookers themselves, right? Instant pot is such significantly superior version of a pressure cooker, and now there are like thousands of Indian brands that have like ripped off the instant pot, and all of these things are now available, but people are still hesitant, right? They think that no, this is not good. I still, when on special occasions, I still avoid the pressure cooker because it spoils. Microwave is another thing, very very poorly adopted. So there is no like fancy new technology that needs to be adopted. I think just adopt the things that have been around for the last 100 years. I think women will spend less time in the kitchen, right? So there is all of these just common day-to-day things actually.
I wanted to ask, so is there any truth to this whole slow cooking thing that's quite popular these days? Because I know, especially in California, there are a band of people who believe in the raw diet, and they won't cook any food above a certain temperature. And I mean, they
It's usually all pseudoscientific nonsense.
Mhm.
Like for starters, let's talk about the raw diet, right?
Sure.
So let's take something like, say, carrots and tomatoes. Okay, um, uh, carrots and tomatoes are 3 times more nutritious when they are cooked than when they are raw. Actually,
Okay.
the number of beta carotene and the amount of lycopene, vitamin C, and all that stuff that you get from tomatoes, for instance, and as well as carrots, is a 3 times more if you eat them cooked as opposed to when you eat them raw. Okay, so this whole, and so yes, obviously, in the context of many other vegetables, etc., cooking does obviously destroy some nutrition, but that's not a universal rule. So the idea that you'll only eat raw food is just patently ridiculous. And if anything, you're going to end up causing indigestion or getting food poisoning. Is all that will happen. Okay, there's a reason why mankind is human beings are the masters of the planet, and one of the reasons is because we've figured out how to cook, and it's been around for for the last 6 billion years. And so the raw diet is obviously patent nonsense. See, the other context of slow food is, I think you have to see it in the context of the US or the West versus India. These are very different. We are coming at it from different places. Okay, in the US, you're coming at it from essentially being captive to the consumer food industry, the likes of McDonald's and Burger Kings and so on, that have literally reduced all food to fast food. Very high calorie, very high on fat, very high on sugar, high on sodium, very high on very easy, cheap carbs, and so on. Again, highly addictive. And so, therefore, the sort of public, at least the elite, backlash against that kind of food to the point where it's more slowly, more deliberately cooked, etc. Right? In India, we've been eating slow food all our lives here. So I think here we have a different problem. Here, the problem is not about fast food causing a problem or Indians suddenly eating too much McDonald's and all that. The far bigger problem is the fact that we are inefficiently spending too much time in the kitchen, right? And just a tiny amount of use of things like fridges and microwaves and better stuffs and instant pots and pressure cookers and better cutting devices, and again, a food industry that gives you par cooked, ready to eat, packaging, packaged food that is like that people that have wide acceptance and so on. Other than I guess bachelors and so on, I don't see people buying some of those ready to eat meals and so on. So it is really that needs to grow up so that people spend amount of less time in the kitchen. So just an interesting thing. The average American spends 30 minutes in a kitchen in an entire day. Okay. The average Indian woman spends 5 hours in the kitchen in a day. I mean, this is a chasm here. I mean, that difference over a lifetime is basically careers, education, just the entire, cognitive and the human potential of one half of the population, really, right? I
mean, in addition to what you just said about the way Americans eat food and the way we eat food, or the kind of food we eat, it baffles me to hear that gourmet has elitist connotations in India, whereas the word itself just means prepared from scratch. And
exactly.
In the US, yeah, that can be a big deal because a lot of people rely on frozen food or alternative options or eating out. In India, we simply don't have that culture of frozen food.
All food is gourmet food.
True.
minus chaat and street food, where actually you're using pre-cooked ingredients and you're integrating them very rapidly, right?
I see.
And that's the only thing. Okay, so anything other than street food in India is gourmet food because it's all cooked from scratch.
So even if the sauce is prepared like earlier in the day, that doesn't count anymore?
Yeah, exactly. Anything that is prepared ahead of time, it doesn't count.
Don't all Indian restaurants do that? They have,
They do.
three or four
Restaurants
sauces.
absolutely do, right? Because they're the free market, and so there, the restaurants have to somehow sort of balance this dilemma of a public that wants to eat everything fresh, but the challenges of running an actual company where the margins simply don't allow you to cook anything from scratch. So that's why restaurants are notoriously secretive about how they cook. Okay, right? If people go and see how food is cooked in a restaurant, uh, it will just shock them. Okay, nothing is fresh. They make base gravies ahead of time. They par cook the meat and all the vegetables ahead of time. Everything is there so that when you order a dal makhani, you can get your table in 10 minutes. Making a dal makhani fresh is an 8-hour affair, including the soaking and the long cooking, slow cooking, and the smoking and all the other rest of the stuff.
So since we're on topic of freshness and pre-cooked ingredients, and also a particular recipe for a particular dish. In the film we notice how one of the relatives give the female protagonist a tip on how to make the most ideal tea. So
Right. Yes.
is there a particular ideal tea, a universal ideal tea?
Yeah, that's the funny thing. There isn't. No two houses will agree on what the definition of an ideal tea is. Right? That's the funny thing. All taste perception, flavor perception is processed by the part of the brain that we now know is the same part of the brain that processes nostalgia. Okay. So therefore, all opinions on food are essentially bullshit because they're all coming from your own biases and your personal experiences and how you experience flavor. And no two people experience flavor the same way, right? And here's the worst part. Flavor perception is not objective. It is completely colored with context like who is cooking, what was the situation, what was your state of mind when you actually ate it, were you hungry, were you starving, was it like a loving situation where your mother cooked it for you, grandmother cooked it for you. All of these things are part of your flavor experience. That is why a terrible dal made by your mother will still taste better than a Michelin star dal made by a award-winning chef. There is no objectivity to flavor at all, right? And tea is particularly a notoriously diverse canvas, right? There is no way and I've seen this, right? I've had colleagues who travel from North India and drink tea in Kerala and say this is complete bullshit tea, right? It is because Keralites like their tea to be lighter, less milky, and completely different flavor profile wise, right? Your Bengali and North Indian tea is very, very milky. And it's different. They use thicker, higher fat cream milk, and Kerala is not a very dairy heavy part of the world. More than 70% of the population of South India is lactose intolerant as adults, right? On the other hand, 70% of North Indians are lactose tolerant. So there is no way, right? And by the way, the tea, it was the British who introduced tea to us in like the 1930s. Okay, it wasn't a thing. It is not some traditional ancient Indian thing. Okay, the British introduced tea drinking to India because they basically were looking for more markets to sell the tea that they were growing in India, and they decided maybe might as well use the growing Indian population, and they founded the Indian Tea Board, and they went and did demonstrations in villages. And funnily enough, what Indians would do is they would drink this and say, it's okay, nothing interesting. So let me make it interesting by adding cardamom and clove and some spices to it to make it more interesting. And that was how masala chai was born. And the Indian Tea Board actually said, no, that's bad. Because if you drink masala tea, you need to use less tea. And that therefore it goes against the sales strategy of them wanting to sell more tea. So they would put out advertising posters that basically said, no, masala tea is not tea. It's not good. The masalas react with the tea badly. And they put all kinds of propaganda. It didn't really work. Masala chai and adrak chai became popular in India because it's a natively Indian sort of invention, if you will. So as I said, there is no such thing, right? Every house makes their own tea, and that's the greatest tea as far as they're concerned.
So did this tea culture begin after the Boston Tea Party, or was it an effort before
Oh no,
that as well?
1930. There
Oh,
was
so
nobody was drinking tea before 1930 at any kind of scale, except the
see.
ones who were closely associated with the British, which is the elites in Indian society. Because the British drank tea, nobody else was drinking tea as a daily beverage.
So, Jeffrey, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, so I mean, I just wanted to add another angle to the scene also. Like, I mean, that scene it also so pretty much like I think most women in our families, right? They tend to remember what all our taste preferences are like. Like, say, if we even with extending to if we have the rest of the family, right? If we have a certain guest come over, I've noticed this within my family, and I've had conversations about this with friends or female friends where they are say where they know exactly how much portions and what tastes what kind of taste preferences their uncles or aunts or grandparents or extended families have, and that itself is like a mental load to I mean overload to have, right? Like that we don't have to worry about. So I think the scene was also commenting on that, right? If it, like what the guy was telling is what the guy was stating as the perfect tea was in fact his idea of the perfect tea, which she has to keep in mind the next time he visits their place. So yeah, I just wanted to like add that to that
Yeah,
point
absolutely,
also.
absolutely.
Yeah,
I think that the joke was about saying that sort of it sounds like biryani was also a perfect retort to
yeah,
that. Yeah.
yeah.
So, there was also the aspect of menstruation, which occupied a significant part of the climax. And it was actually interesting to look at menstruation out of all other female biological processes to be the one considered impure, and its relation to the kitchen and cooking particularly. It had a very the evolution of it seems quite interesting. Would you like to comment on that, sir?
I actually honestly I am not particularly an expert, or I've not really sort of read beyond the basic sort of taboos. Almost all societies have menstrual taboos, and almost all of them have taboos against it being particularly with regard to food, because food almost always has had connotations of purity, and in many societies blood is seen as being impure. And so this is something that happens once a month and so on. It is not surprising that almost everywhere in the world that there are food and kitchen related taboos with regard to menstruation at some point of time or the other, until it kind of went away over time and so on. I don't know if anyone else maybe has opinions or any other deeper insights into that.
I think not. Uh, that's fair. I mean, that's a very fair take on.
I think also the way, the way it was portrayed in the film, right? I think I've only heard of it in secondhand because I was brought up in a Christian background. That too, we didn't that too in a family of three boys, so I haven't really had that kind of exposure to how menstruation is treated within our households. But I've had I've heard instances of this, like right being made to use another sheet of being made to stay away from the kitchen, being made to sleep without sleep on a mattress, sleep on the floor, or the that echo the portrayal of it in the film
Yeah.
from people I know. So I guess I can attest to that. I don't know how what to comment on beyond the way it apart from attesting that yes, it does happen in today's households too.
Yeah.
Uh,
No, I think so. One is that I grew up in a conservative family, and relatively, but
yeah,
not like quite extreme. But uh, And again, but I also grew up in a family with 3 boys, right? And so so my mother was the only woman in the house, and so on. And so what ends up happening actually is that in situations like this, people are quite happy to compromise, because I think the labor of having someone cook your food is more important than your ability to maintain this practice of religious taboos and so on. So it's quite interesting to see that I often would find that families that had like more women, like siblings and sisters, and maybe mother-in-law also being there and so on, and especially households perhaps where you had access to labor that could end up cooking your food during that time, they would maintain these taboos, because at that point it's like, oh, now I can I can apparently signal my sort of religious purity by obeying this or by observing this, right? At some level, if it's all boys, then practicality rules. Then sorry, I need you to do that labor for me anyway. So I'm willing to ignore this.
Yeah, I guess I can attest. Like I've had, I guess I can attest to some of what Krish mentioned. Like I think we have heard, like say whenever we have had guests come over, right? Like me and my brothers, we would be handling the distribution, like the setting up the tables or serving the food and etc. All these other tasks, and also cleaning up and whatnot. Like we kind of have like different chores spaced out between all of us. And like my mom used to get comments from all the women saying that, okay, it's nice that you have it's nice that you have boys, so like they'll be doing this who can do this for you, and so on, so on. And that itself is like something to take note of, right? Like if any of us were girls, then it would have been either been ignored, or a huge chunk of the work would have been handed off to her, right?
Yes.
So yeah, I guess that's something to take note of, or like just to an observation that one can take away.
Are there any Christian codes regarding menstruation and the purity of the kitchen, the sanctity of the kitchen?
Nothing that comes to mind right now. I haven't really read the I haven't really had the read much about it in my memory. I don't know. I don't really know. I can't really answer the question. I'll have to do some
So
digging
actually,
up.
so from what I have read, I think the among religions, among major religions, sort of Christianity and Buddhism are the most lenient when it comes to menstrual taboos. And some of the others are much more stricter. But again, in even here, I think it came as a result of the fact that Christianity itself sort of originated in Judaism, right? And the Old Testament is actually quite ridiculously strict menstrual taboos, right? So all your Leviticus and the Torah in general is like pretty strict. So Jews are far more likely to be Orthodox Jews are exceedingly strict about these things. But in some sense, I think a lot of early Christianity was, in a sense, a protest against some of the more extreme elements of Judaism. So in that sense, I think it had the advantage of being slightly more liberal in areas where it therefore allowed it to sort of have more followers in the early days.
Yeah. That's fair.
Yeah.
So I think we're in some sense reaching the end of our discussion.
Just one thing, I did know that I did have a friend who sort of who was Eastern Orthodox, right? Basically the so there was a schism in the church, right? So the Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church, right? And so the Eastern Orthodox Church is actually much more stricter and has a lot more taboos about this than the Catholic Church. So
I'm supposing the Protestant church is a lot more stricter in that sense. It's
not
a
really.
lot.
Actually, Protestants are far more liberal. Actually,
Yeah,
because it happened in the 15th century. It's a Reformation, right? So Protestantism was actually a protest against the ritual orthodoxy of Catholicism. So it was and Catholicism itself, in some sense, was a protest against the orthodoxy of Judaism, right? So therefore, so progressively, it just got sort of more and more.
Yeah, but the thing is, I don't know how this applies in the Indian context, because there are certain things that we have borrowed from Hindu culture, or any like the dominant culture at the time. So like certain practices and so on. So I don't know how much of that intermixes here.
Oh yes, I'm sure there are sort
So
of, especially in cultures where sort of where there is a predominant local sort of culture and so on, you're going to find many of these things being adopted locally as well, right? And especially a couple, I find that caste is something that tends to be pretty resilient, even amongst both Christians and Muslim communities across India, in whatever shape or form, not in quite exactly the same way, but in their own way.
That's fair. I think I can attest to that since I attended a Muslim Haldi very recently, and I'm supposing Haldi is something that is where, in some sense, unique to Hindus.
Right. Yep.
So I think we are, in some sense, reaching the end of our discussion. So before we leave, we can probably share our closing comments and we can end the discussion. Would you like to go ahead, sir?
I just want
Yeah, no. So I think I've already
It
spoken a
was
lot, so
absolutely
I'll just end
fascinating.
Sorry, I was just going to say that since I spoke quite a lot, so I'll just sort of close very briefly by saying that I think it's the sort of film. It's a sort of film that really shines a very high resolution mirror, better than most other films. And I think the film's greatest strength is the fact that it has believable characters, and that it does not feel, barring the absolute final scene, the entirety of the movie, there is like it just feels like you're just you're like a drone hovering in somebody's house and you're just watching the action. That's the pacing. It's like literally like a day in the life, if you will. And it is and I think that's the fact that they managed to pull that kind of pacing off, with therefore that sort of payoff at the end. It's almost at some point of time you're sort of wondering, okay, how is this going to end, right? And I think in that sense, I really found it a very deeply satisfying film that I at least, as not a film expert, sort of film that I think both film experts as well as mass audiences would both love, in a sense.
That's an interesting take. Thank you, sir. And Vivek, do you want to go next?
Yeah, I just wanted to say, wanted to thank Mr. Ashok for being here, because the discussion has been fascinating, not just about the film, but beyond the film as well. We all learned quite a bit. So even though, we had this unfortunate situation where the director faced a power cut in his location and the network coverage was not strong enough to have him join over the voice call, I don't think it has been any less fascinating to hear you. So thank you for being here.
Okay, thank you.
yeah, thank you for your thoughts. It's been a real pleasure.
So I think we can probably close the discussion. And thank you so much, sir, for joining us and being so patient. And we are really sorry about the inconvenience.
Hey, no worries. It was good fun.